The screaming started before Captain Marcus Steele could even see her. Across the shattered remains of Shadowmere's outer defenses, human soldiers dropped their weapons and fled in pure, instinctive terror as Queen Seraphina of the Sanguine Empire descended from the crimson sky like death-given form. Her wings, midnight black and spanning 20 feet, blotted out the binary sunset as she landed with predatory grace that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary perfection in the art of hunting. Marcus felt the same primal fear that was driving his comrades to panic. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything except stand in the open where those burning crimson eyes could find him. The supernatural aura of dread that radiated from the vampire queen hit him like a physical force, triggering fight-or-flight responses that had kept humanity alive since they first encountered large predators in ancient caves. But Marcus didn't move. He couldn't move. Not because fear had paralyzed him, but because someone had to hold the line. Someone had to stand between the most dangerous predator in known space and the civilian evacuation routes that were still processing thousands of refugees. Someone had to buy time for people who couldn't protect themselves, regardless of the personal cost. So Captain Marcus Steele remained at his post, assault rifle steady in his hands despite the tremor that threatened to betray his terror, watching as Queen Seraphina folded her massive wings and surveyed the battlefield with the satisfaction of an apex predator whose reputation had just emptied another military position without requiring actual combat. She was everything the intelligence briefings had described and worse. 8 feet of pale, elegant death wrapped in armor that seemed to flow like liquid shadow. Her face might have been beautiful by human standards if not for the predatory intelligence in those crimson eyes and the fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers when she smiled. The Sanguines had evolved to hunt humanoid prey, and every aspect of their physiology, the hypnotic gaze, the paralyzing presence, the supernatural speed and strength, served that singular purpose with terrifying efficiency. Interesting, Queen Seraphina said, her voice carrying clearly across the abandoned defensive position. She moved toward Marcus with fluid steps that made no sound on the rubble-strewn ground. One remains. Marcus kept his weapon trained on her, knowing it was futile but maintaining military discipline because it was all he had left. Standard human weapons were useless against sanguine royalty, their regenerative abilities could heal bullet wounds faster than conventional firearms could inflict them, and their supernatural speed made accurate targeting nearly impossible. Captain Marcus Steele, Terran Defense Corps, he said, his voice steady despite the fear that made his heart hammer against his ribs. Serial number 7742 Delta Niner. I did not ask for your identification, little soldier, Queen Seraphina replied, stopping just outside arm's reach. This close, Marcus could see the predatory perfection of her features, skin like pale starlight, eyes that held depths of crimson fire, and an otherworldly beauty that made her even more terrifying. I asked why you remain when your comrades have fled. Because this is where I'm supposed to be. Queen Seraphina tilted her head with bird-like curiosity, studying him as if he were a fascinating specimen that defied easy classification. You know what I am. You know what I can do. Yet you stand here with your ineffective weapon and your quaint human courage, believing that your presence serves some purpose. My presence serves the purpose of holding this position until relieved or overrun. And you believe relief is coming? Marcus met her burning gaze directly, understanding that showing weakness now would trigger predator responses that might make his death swift rather than useful. I believe that hope isn't required for duty, Your Majesty. The formal address seemed to surprise her. Most humans who encountered sanguine royalty were too terrified for coherent speech, let alone diplomatic courtesy. You know my rank. Intelligence briefings are thorough, Your Majesty. We know who you are, what you've accomplished, and why you're here. And yet you remain, she repeated, circling him slowly with movements that reminded Marcus of a large cat deciding whether its prey was worth the effort to kill. Tell me, Captain Steele, what do your intelligence briefings say about my dietary requirements? Marcus forced himself to remain still as she completed her circle, fighting every evolutionary instinct that screamed at him to track the predator's movement. That sanguines require life force from humanoid species to survive. That your people have turned feeding into an art form. That you personally have drained the life from thousands of human soldiers. Tens of thousands, she corrected with casual pride. Over 3 centuries of warfare. I have personally ended more human lives than your entire planet's military casualties in all previous conflicts combined. Yes, Your Majesty. And this knowledge does not inspire you to flee like your companions? Marcus considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer might determine whether this conversation continued or ended in his immediate death. Fear and duty often point in opposite directions, Your Majesty. Today, duty pointed here. Queen Seraphina stopped circling and faced him directly, her supernatural presence making the air itself feel thick and oppressive. When she spread her wings, not to their full span, but enough to frame her imposing figure. The gesture should have sent Marcus to his knees in terror. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly to maintain better balance, his weapon still raised but not aggressively aimed. Remarkable, she murmured. 3 years of war, hundreds of battlefields, thousands of human soldiers, and you are the first to meet my gaze without cowering. With respect, Your Majesty, cowering wouldn't serve my mission objectives. And what are those objectives, Captain Steele? Marcus realized that his answer to this question would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the fate of everyone still within Shadowmere's walls. Queen Seraphina wasn't simply making conversation, she was conducting an interrogation with life and death stakes. To hold this position and deny enemy access to civilian evacuation routes for as long as possible. Even though you cannot possibly succeed. Success isn't measured only by survival, Your Majesty. Sometimes it's measured by time bought, lives saved, or duties fulfilled regardless of personal cost. Queen Seraphina studied him with an intensity that made Marcus feel like she was examining his soul for flaws or deceptions. Her crimson eyes seemed to pierce through every psychological defense he built during years of military service. You speak of duty as if it were a religion. For soldiers, it is. And you are prepared to die for this religion? If necessary. Even knowing that your death will accomplish nothing. That I will simply proceed to drain the life from every civilian you are trying to protect. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, but his voice remained steady. Then I'll have bought them time to evacuate, and someone else will have to make the same choice I'm making now. Someone else will have to stand and die uselessly. Someone else will have to stand and hope their sacrifice means something. Queen Seraphina was quiet for several heartbeats, her alien beauty making the silence feel charged with supernatural tension. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been curiosity. Captain Steele, in 3 centuries of existence, I have encountered courage, cowardice, desperation, rage, and every other emotion your species is capable of experiencing under extreme stress. But I have never encountered anything quite like what you are demonstrating. Which is calm acceptance of necessary sacrifice without hope of reward or recognition. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, maintaining readiness despite the growing certainty that conventional combat wasn't going to resolve this encounter. Your Majesty, what did you expect to find when you arrived at this position? Fled soldiers, abandoned equipment, and clear access to the civilian populations I came to harvest. And instead, I found one human who refuses to flee, refuses to attack, and refuses to despair. Queen Seraphina moved closer, her supernatural presence intensifying until Marcus could feel it like pressure against his skin. You are either the bravest member of your species I have encountered, or the most foolish. Perhaps both, Your Majesty. To Marcus's surprise, Queen Seraphina laughed, a sound like crystal chimes that somehow managed to be both beautiful and terrifying. Indeed. Perhaps both. She extended her wings to their full span, a display of predatory magnificence that should have triggered absolute terror in any human witness. The gesture was clearly designed to be his final warning: submit to the fear or face the consequences of continued defiance. Marcus looked up at 20 feet of midnight black wingspan, at claws that could shred armor plating, at a predator whose very existence was proof that humans were not the apex species they had believed themselves to be. And he still didn't run. Fascinating, Queen Seraphina said softly, folding her wings as she studied his unwavering stance. Tell me, Captain, what would it take to make you flee? Marcus considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to tactical problems. Confirmation that the civilian evacuation was complete and my continued presence served no strategic purpose. Not the threat of death. Death is a possible outcome of any military engagement, Your Majesty. It affects tactical calculations, but it doesn't determine them. Not the threat of torture. Information security protocols cover resistance to interrogation techniques. Not the threat to those civilians you are trying to protect. Marcus felt his resolve waver for the first time, understanding that she had identified his psychological pressure point with predatory precision. That would be more challenging to ignore. And yet you would still stand here, knowing that your defiance might enrage me enough to make their deaths more painful than necessary. The question hung between them like a blade, forcing Marcus to confront the possibility that his courage might be serving his ego rather than his duty. I would hope, he said finally, that Your Majesty's reputation for strategic thinking would override any personal satisfaction derived from causing unnecessary suffering. Queen Seraphina stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Captain Steele, she said eventually, you have just made the most dangerous assumption of your military career. Which is that I am rational enough to appreciate the difference between necessary and unnecessary suffering. As the vampire queen smiled, revealing fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers in the fading light, Marcus realized that his greatest gamble was about to be tested. The bet that even apex predators could be reasoned with when the stakes were high enough. Queen Seraphina's smile revealed the full extent of her predatory nature, fangs that could tear through armor plating, jaw muscles capable of crushing bone, and behind those crimson eyes, the calculating intelligence of someone who had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of psychological warfare. Captain Steele, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed designed to resonate in human nervous systems, I find myself curious about the limits of your courage. Marcus remained motionless, his weapon still raised but recognizing that the real battle was being fought through words rather than bullets. I'm prepared to find out, Your Majesty. Are you? Because I suspect that your bravery, impressive though it may be, stems from incomplete understanding of your situation. I understand the situation perfectly. You're here to feed on civilian populations. I'm here to prevent that for as long as possible. Queen Seraphina began moving again, not circling this time but pacing back and forth with restless energy that reminded Marcus of caged predators he'd seen in zoos. Her wings flexed slightly with each step, creating shifting patterns of shadow that made her seem larger and more threatening. You understand the tactical situation, she corrected. But you do not understand me. Your Majesty. You see a monster, Captain. A creature of supernatural evil who kills for pleasure and feeds on fear. Your intelligence briefings have reduced me to a collection of abilities and body counts, haven't they? Marcus considered her words carefully, understanding that this conversation had moved beyond simple interrogation into something more complex. Intelligence briefings focus on threat assessment and tactical capabilities, he said. Personal motivations are secondary considerations. Exactly. So you know what I can do, but not why I do it. Queen Seraphina stopped pacing and faced him directly. Tell me, Captain, do you know how sanguines reproduce? The question caught Marcus off guard. I'm not sure that's relevant to. Answer the question. Biological reproduction requires life force integration from compatible species. Sanguine offspring need humanoid energy patterns to develop properly. And how long do sanguine pregnancies last? Marcus realized she was leading him toward some point that would change his understanding of their conflict. Intelligence estimates suggest longer than human gestation periods. 7 years, Captain. 7 years during which the developing child requires constant life force supplementation, or it dies in the womb. Queen Seraphina's voice carried a note of something that might have been pain. Do you know how many sanguine children have been born in the past decade? I don't have access to those statistics. 3. 3 children in 10 years, from a population of nearly 1 million adults. She moved closer, her supernatural presence making the air feel charged with tension. My species is dying, Captain Steele. Not from war, not from disease, but from simple biological mathematics. Marcus felt his understanding of the conflict shifting as implications became clear. The war isn't about conquest. The war is about survival. Every world we take, every human population we harvest, buys my people a few more years of existence. Queen Seraphina's eyes blazed with intensity that had nothing to do with supernatural power. We are not monsters by choice, Captain. We are monsters by necessity. That doesn't justify. Justify? Queen Seraphina's voice rose, carrying harmonics that made Marcus's bones ache. Captain, if your species faced extinction, how many alien lives would you sacrifice to ensure human children could be born? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the possibility that his enemy's actions might be driven by desperation rather than malice. I would hope we could find alternatives to genocide. As would I. As have I. Do you think this war was my first choice? Do you believe I enjoy watching children die for crimes they have not committed? I don't know. No, you do not know. Because your intelligence briefings did not mention the 50 years I spent searching for synthetic alternatives to humanoid life force. They did not mention the peace overtures I sent to every major human government before the first shot was fired. They did not mention that I personally executed 3 sanguine nobles who advocated for immediate military action instead of continued diplomatic efforts. Marcus stared at her, trying to reconcile the monster from intelligence reports with the ruler she was describing. Your Majesty, if that's true, then why? Why am I here, personally overseeing the harvest of human civilians? Queen Seraphina's laugh carried notes of bitterness that had nothing to do with predatory satisfaction. Because 50 years of diplomacy produced nothing but delays, excuses, and proposals for research that might someday yield solutions while my people continued dying. But surely there were other options. Captain Steele, tell me what options you would pursue if human extinction was inevitable within 2 generations unless you could secure resources that another species controlled. Marcus found himself thinking like a military strategist rather than a defender, considering the problem from the perspective of someone responsible for species survival rather than individual conscience. Negotiation. Trade agreements. Research partnerships. Military pressure as a last resort. All of which I attempted. Negotiation failed when human governments proved unwilling to authorize voluntary life force donations. Trade agreements collapsed when your people realized what we needed could not be provided through commerce. Research partnerships ended when human scientists abandoned projects after discovering that sanguine reproduction requires living donors rather than laboratory substitutes. And military pressure has brought us to this moment, you standing defiant while I explain why your defiance, admirable though it may be, serves no purpose except to delay the inevitable. Marcus felt the weight of her logic pressing against everything he believed about their conflict. If Queen Seraphina was telling the truth, then the war wasn't between good and evil but between competing survival imperatives. Your Majesty, what are you asking me to do? I am asking you to understand that courage without context is merely stubborn ignorance. You stand here ready to die for people who will die regardless, defending a position that cannot be held, serving a cause that cannot succeed. And the alternative is to step aside and let you harvest them? The alternative is to recognize that their deaths serve a purpose larger than individual tragedy. That their life force will enable sanguine children to be born. That species survival sometimes requires sacrifices that individuals cannot willingly make. Marcus found himself at the center of a philosophical hurricane, trying to maintain moral clarity while grappling with arguments that challenged every assumption about right and wrong. Your Majesty, from your perspective, this is about species survival. From mine, it's about murder on an industrial scale. And both perspectives are accurate, Captain. That is what makes this war tragic rather than simply evil. But you still intend to proceed. I still intend to ensure that my people survive, yes. The question is whether you intend to force me to add your death to the casualties that weigh on my conscience. Marcus realized that Queen Seraphina was offering him a choice that went beyond simple surrender or resistance. She was asking him to acknowledge the moral complexity of their situation while accepting the practical limitations of his position. Your Majesty, if I step aside, will you minimize the suffering of the people you harvest? I will ensure that their deaths serve the greatest possible purpose with the least possible pain. And if I continue to resist, then you will die here, uselessly, and your defiance will serve no one except your own need to maintain moral purity in an immoral situation. Marcus looked around the abandoned defensive position, noting the silence that indicated his fellow soldiers had successfully completed their evacuation of the outer districts. Time he had bought through this conversation, even if Queen Seraphina was right about its ultimate futility. Your Majesty, may I ask you a question? Proceed. In 3 centuries of existence, have you ever encountered a problem that seemed impossible until someone found a solution no one had previously considered? Queen Seraphina's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing the predatory focus that had characterized their conversation. Captain Steele, are you suggesting that our current situation might admit of solutions that neither of us has considered? I'm suggesting that someone who has ruled successfully for 3 centuries and someone who has found courage in impossible circumstances might be capable of discovering alternatives that haven't been explored. Such as? I don't know yet. But I know that this conversation has revealed complexities that intelligence briefings never mentioned. And I suspect that if we can find common ground between species survival and individual conscience, we might find approaches that serve both. Queen Seraphina stared at him for a long moment, her supernatural presence seeming to intensify as she considered his words. Captain Marcus Steele, she said finally, you have just proposed the most dangerous idea either of us could consider. Which is that enemies might become allies when they discover their interests align in ways that were not previously apparent. As the implications of her words settled between them, Marcus realized that his decision to stand his ground had led to something neither of them had expected, the beginning of a conversation that might change everything. The silence that followed Queen Seraphina's admission stretched between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Marcus could hear the distant sounds of evacuation procedures continuing in the deeper parts of Shadowmere, evidence that his stand was still buying precious time for civilian escape routes. Your Majesty, he said carefully, if we're going to consider alternatives to the current situation, I need to understand the exact parameters of your people's survival requirements. Queen Seraphina's expression showed wariness mixed with something that might have been hope. Captain, such information could be considered state secrets of the highest classification. And sharing it with an enemy would be treason. Precisely. She moved closer, her supernatural presence making the air shimmer with barely contained energy. Yet you are no longer behaving like an enemy, are you? Marcus considered the question while maintaining his defensive stance. Everything about this conversation violated military protocol, diplomatic procedure, and common sense. But it was also the first time in 3 years of warfare that anyone had discussed alternatives to mutual annihilation. I'm behaving like someone who recognizes that our current trajectory leads to outcomes that neither of us actually wants. Explain. Your goal is species survival through access to humanoid life force. My goal is protecting human civilian populations from predation. These seem mutually exclusive, but they might not be if we consider approaches that neither side has seriously explored. Queen Seraphina folded her massive wings against her back, the gesture somehow making her seem less predatory and more approachable. Continue. Human medical science has developed techniques for voluntary life force donation, blood transfusions, plasma sharing, even temporary energy field synchronization for medical treatment. We've never explored these techniques for interspecies application because we've never had reason to. You're suggesting voluntary cooperation between humans and sanguines. I'm suggesting that the resource you need to survive might be obtainable through means that don't require the death or enslavement of the donors. Queen Seraphina stared at him with an intensity that made Marcus feel like she was examining every facet of his proposal for flaws or deceptions. Captain Steele, do you understand what you are suggesting? That we explore whether mutual benefit might be possible instead of assuming mutual destruction is inevitable. You are suggesting that I trust the species I have been at war with for 3 years to provide voluntary access to the resources my people need to avoid extinction. And I'm suggesting that humans trust the species we've been fleeing from for 3 years to honor agreements that would make us partners rather than prey. Queen Seraphina began pacing again, but this time her movements suggested someone working through complex problems rather than a predator stalking its victim. The political obstacles would be immense, she said. Sanguine nobility who view humans as livestock. Human governments who see my people as monsters. Military establishments on both sides who have built their identities around this conflict. Political obstacles can be overcome if the alternative is species extinction for you and genocide for us. Can they? Captain, you have stood here courageously for. She paused, consulting some internal chronometer, 43 minutes. In that time, my forces have established complete control over Shadowmere's outer districts. Resistance has ceased. Civilian evacuation routes have been secured. Marcus felt his heart skip as he realized what she was telling him. Your forces have taken the evacuation routes. My forces have been monitoring the evacuation routes, Queen Seraphina corrected with a slight smile. There is a difference. You've been letting them escape. I have been allowing our conversation to continue without interference from tactical necessities. Marcus stared at her, understanding dawning that changed everything about their interaction. This entire engagement has been a test. This entire engagement has been an evaluation. Of your courage, your intelligence, your capacity for strategic thinking under extreme pressure, and most importantly, your ability to see beyond the immediate tactical situation to larger possibilities. You could have taken the city hours ago. I could have taken the city 3 days ago. I chose instead to observe how humans respond when facing inevitable defeat. Most of your comrades demonstrated exactly the behavior our psychological profiles predicted: panic, flight, abandonment of defensive positions. But not all. But not you. Queen Seraphina moved closer, her supernatural presence somehow feeling less threatening than it had at the beginning of their encounter. Captain Steele, in 43 minutes of conversation, you have accomplished something that 50 years of formal diplomacy could not achieve. Which is? You have convinced me that humans might be capable of partnership rather than simply serving as resources to be harvested. Marcus realized that his decision to stand his ground had been more consequential than he'd understood. And in 43 minutes, you've convinced me that sanguines might be capable of reasoning rather than simply predation. So where does that leave us? Marcus looked around the abandoned defensive position, thinking about the civilians who were still escaping through routes that Queen Seraphina could close at any moment, about the war that had consumed both their species for 3 years, and about the possibility of alternatives that neither side had seriously considered. It leaves us with the most dangerous proposal either of us could make to our respective governments. Which is a ceasefire for the purpose of exploring cooperative solutions to resource management challenges that affect both our species. Queen Seraphina's laugh was different this time, less predatory satisfaction and more genuine amusement. Captain, do you realize that what you are proposing could be considered treason by both our peoples? I realize that what I'm proposing could end this war without either species facing extinction. Or it could be seen as collaboration with the enemy, punishable by execution under both human and sanguine military law. Marcus considered this, understanding the risks but also recognizing the opportunity. Your Majesty, what's the worst thing that could happen if we try and fail? Court-martial, execution, disgrace, and resumption of warfare that leads to mutual destruction. And what's the worst thing that happens if we don't try? Mutual destruction without even the possibility of alternatives. So the risk of trying is the same as the certainty of not trying, except that trying offers a chance of success. Queen Seraphina studied him with an expression that had evolved from predatory assessment to something approaching respect. Captain Steele, you argue like someone who has experience convincing superiors to authorize dangerous missions. I argue like someone who understands that some risks are worth taking when the status quo is unacceptable. And you believe this risk is worth taking? Marcus thought about the question seriously, weighing his duty as a human soldier against the possibility of ending a war that was consuming both civilizations. Your Majesty, I believe that 43 minutes ago, I was prepared to die to buy a few more hours for civilian evacuations. If I was willing to risk my life for something that temporary, I should be willing to risk my career for something that could be permanent. Even if it means trusting someone who has personally killed thousands of your fellow humans. Marcus met her crimson gaze directly, understanding that his answer would determine whether their conversation could become something more than philosophical debate. Your Majesty, it means trusting someone who has demonstrated the capacity for strategic thinking, moral complexity, and genuine concern for her people's survival. Someone who could have ended this conversation with violence but chose dialogue instead. And if that trust proves misplaced? Then I'll have died attempting something worthwhile instead of something futile. Queen Seraphina was quiet for several minutes, her attention seemingly focused on sounds and sensations beyond Marcus's perception. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone making decisions that would reshape history. Captain Steele, my forces report that civilian evacuation from Shadowmere is now complete. Approximately 12,000 humans have reached safety beyond our operational perimeter. Marcus felt relief flood through him like a physical force. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. Thank me if we can transform this temporary reprieve into permanent solution. She extended her wings slightly, the gesture somehow conveying consideration rather than threat. Captain, I am prepared to propose an unprecedented arrangement to my war council. What kind of arrangement? Immediate cessation of offensive operations against human civilian populations in exchange for joint research into sustainable resource sharing between our species. Marcus stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. A ceasefire? A ceasefire with explicit goals and timelines. 6 months to determine whether voluntary cooperation can meet sanguine survival needs without requiring human casualties. And if the research proves unsuccessful? Then we resume warfare with full knowledge that alternatives were explored and found inadequate. Queen Seraphina's expression grew serious. But Captain, you must understand the magnitude of what you would be asking your people to accept. Explain. Voluntary cooperation would require humans to provide access to life force donations on a scale sufficient to support sanguine reproduction and child development. Thousands of donors, sophisticated medical facilities, ongoing commitment that could span decades. Marcus felt the weight of the proposal settling on his shoulders. In exchange for sanguine technology, scientific knowledge, and military protection for human worlds that choose to participate in cooperative arrangements. My people's capabilities could serve human expansion and development rather than threatening human survival. You're talking about alliance rather than ceasefire. I am talking about partnership between species that recognize mutual benefit serves both their interests better than mutual destruction. Marcus realized that Queen Seraphina had thought through implications far beyond their immediate tactical situation. She wasn't just proposing an end to current hostilities, she was outlining a framework for completely reimagining the relationship between their civilizations. Your Majesty, what makes you think either of our governments would consider such radical changes? Because both our governments are losing this war, Captain. Sanguine casualties are mounting as human defensive technology improves. Human losses are devastating your population centers faster than they can be rebuilt. Neither side can achieve decisive victory without Pyrrhic costs that would make victory meaningless. So this proposal serves both sides' strategic interests. This proposal serves both sides' survival interests, which makes it politically viable despite being culturally revolutionary. Marcus looked at this remarkable being who had arrived as his enemy and become something approaching an ally through 43 minutes of honest conversation about impossible problems. Your Majesty, what do you need from me to make this proposal credible to both our governments? I need you to return to Human Command with a formal offer of ceasefire terms and resource-sharing negotiations. I need you to convince your leadership that cooperation serves human interests better than continued resistance. And you'll convince Sanguine leadership that partnership serves your interests better than continued predation? I will present evidence that sustainable resource acquisition through voluntary cooperation offers better long-term prospects than unsustainable resource extraction through military conquest. Marcus understood that he was being asked to become a diplomat in addition to being a soldier, representing possibilities that neither government had seriously considered. Your Majesty, if I do this, if I carry your proposal to Human Command, what guarantees can you offer that this isn't an elaborate deception designed to achieve through negotiation what you couldn't achieve through force? Queen Seraphina smiled, the expression somehow managing to be both predatory and genuinely warm. Captain Steele, I can offer you the same guarantee you can offer me. That someone willing to risk their career and reputation for the possibility of peace is someone whose word can be trusted even across species barriers. No guarantees except mutual trust. No guarantees except the recognition that trust, however dangerous, offers better prospects than assured mutual destruction. As they stood facing each other in the abandoned defensive position, Marcus realized that his decision to remain at his post had led to something neither of them could have anticipated, the first genuine opportunity for peace their species had encountered in 3 years of warfare. Your Majesty, he said formally, I accept your proposal to serve as diplomatic courier for ceasefire negotiations between human and Sanguine governments. And I accept your offer to serve as advocate for cooperative alternatives to resource conflict. Queen Seraphina extended one pale hand toward him, not a predatory gesture, but an offer of partnership across impossible differences. Captain Steele, shall we discover whether enemies can become allies when they choose understanding over assumption? Marcus looked at the offered hand, understanding that accepting it would commit him to the most dangerous mission of his military career. Then he reached out and grasped it firmly, feeling her surprising warmth as their very different species made contact for the first time in history as potential partners rather than predator and prey. Your Majesty, he said quietly, let's find out. 6 months later, Captain Marcus Steele stood in the observation deck of Harmony Station, the first joint human-Sanguine facility in galactic history, watching as ships from both civilizations docked side by side at the orbital platform that had become the symbol of their unprecedented alliance. The court-martial proceedings had been brutal. 3 weeks of testimony, cross-examination, and political grandstanding as military prosecutors argued that Marcus had exceeded his authority by negotiating with enemy leadership. But the ceasefire agreement he'd helped broker had already produced results that made his insubordination look like strategic brilliance rather than dangerous improvisation. Any regrets? Queen Seraphina asked, joining him at the viewport. 6 months of regular cooperation had transformed their relationship from wary alliance to genuine partnership, though she still retained the otherworldly beauty that made her simultaneously fascinating and intimidating. About which part? Nearly getting executed for unauthorized diplomacy, or helping establish the most successful peace agreement in recent galactic history? Both. Marcus smiled, watching a human medical transport dock alongside a Sanguine research vessel. No regrets. Though I have to admit, explaining vampire biology to human politicians was more challenging than facing down your supernatural aura of terror. And I discovered that convincing Sanguine nobles to view humans as partners rather than resources required skills I hadn't developed in 3 centuries of traditional leadership. Their joint presentation to both governments had been the most diplomatically complex negotiation either species had ever attempted. Marcus had faced skeptical human officials who viewed any cooperation with Sanguines as collaboration with monsters, while Queen Seraphina had confronted noble houses that considered voluntary resource sharing a betrayal of Sanguine supremacy. But the mathematics of survival had proven more persuasive than cultural prejudice. Detailed projections showing mutual destruction as the inevitable outcome of continued warfare had gradually convinced pragmatic leaders on both sides that cooperation served everyone's interests better than extinction. The medical program results came in this morning, Queen Seraphina said, consulting a data pad that displayed information in both human and Sanguine formats. Voluntary life force donations from human medical volunteers have successfully supported the development of 4 sanguine pregnancies to full term. 4 healthy births. 4 healthy children who would not exist without human cooperation. The first generation born through alliance rather than predation. Marcus felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the station's environmental systems. Those 4 children represented proof that their impossible proposal had worked. That former enemies could indeed become partners when they chose understanding over fear. And the human side of the exchange? Sanguine regenerative technology has reduced human casualties from industrial accidents by 67% across all participating colonies. Our tissue regeneration techniques have eliminated the need for organ transplants in most medical cases. And our longevity treatments have extended average human lifespan by approximately 40 years. Mutual benefit. Exponential mutual benefit. Human innovation combined with sanguine biological capabilities has produced advances that neither species could have achieved independently. Marcus watched a group of human technicians working alongside sanguine engineers on what appeared to be a new type of spacecraft that incorporated design elements from both civilizations. The sight still amazed him. Former enemies collaborating so naturally that their species' differences seemed like complementary strengths rather than incompatible barriers. Queen Seraphina, he said formally, though their friendship had made such titles feel increasingly artificial, I have a confession. Oh. When I decided not to run from you at Shadowmere, I wasn't being brave. I was being terrified and stubborn in equal measure. She laughed, the sound that had lost its predatory edge and become simply musical. Captain Steele, when I chose to engage you in conversation rather than immediate combat, I wasn't being diplomatic. I was being curious about someone who defied every psychological profile we had developed for your species. So we were both improvising. We were both discovering that our assumptions about each other were incomplete. Marcus thought about the journey that had brought them from that defensive position to this observation deck where former enemies had become trusted partners. The process hadn't been simple or swift. 6 months of careful negotiation, technological development, cultural exchange, and gradual trust building that had required patience from both species. Your Majesty, he said, what do you think would have happened if I had run like everyone else? You would have lived longer in the short term and died eventually when the war reached its inevitable conclusion. Your people would have continued viewing mine as monsters, my people would have continued viewing yours as resources, and both species would have destroyed each other within a generation. And now? Now human children and sanguine children are learning each other's languages in integrated educational programs. Now our scientists are developing technologies that serve both species' advancement. Now we have proof that cooperation creates possibilities that conflict could never achieve. Marcus nodded, watching a mixed crew of humans and sanguines collaborate on what appeared to be a cultural exchange program orientation. Do you think this alliance will last? I think this alliance will evolve. The next generation, children who grow up with interspecies cooperation as normal rather than revolutionary, will probably develop relationships we can't even imagine. Such as integrated communities where species differences are seen as complementary rather than divisive. Research partnerships that combine human creativity with sanguine capabilities in ways that transform both civilizations. Perhaps even hybrid families where adoption and alliance create bonds stronger than biological kinship. Marcus considered the implications of what she was describing, a future where the barriers between their species became bridges instead. That's a remarkably optimistic vision. It's a vision based on evidence rather than hope. Captain, what we've accomplished in 6 months proves that enemies can become allies when they choose to understand each other rather than simply defeat each other. And what comes next? What comes next is that other species who are currently in conflict will observe our success and wonder whether they too might find alternatives to mutual destruction. Queen Seraphina moved closer to the viewport, her expression showing satisfaction mixed with anticipation. Captain Steele, I believe we have created a model for peace that could transform galactic civilization. Through vampire-human cooperation. Through recognition that diversity strengthens civilizations rather than threatening them. Through understanding that cooperation serves survival better than competition. Through proof that former enemies can become partners when they choose to build rather than destroy. Marcus looked at this remarkable being who had become his closest friend and most trusted ally, noting how their partnership had grown from desperate necessity to genuine affection that transcended every difference between their species. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "what we've built here is more than just a peace agreement. What we've built here is proof that love, in all its forms, is stronger than fear, understanding is more powerful than assumption, and choosing to trust someone despite impossible differences can create miracles that change everything." As they stood together watching the evidence of their success, Marcus understood that his decision to stand his ground at Shadowmere had led to something far greater than he'd ever imagined. He'd intended to buy time for civilian evacuations, but he'd actually bought time for two civilizations to discover they could create a better future together than either could achieve alone. "Captain Steele," Queen Seraphina said formally, "it has been my honor to serve as your partner in the most important mission either of us has ever undertaken. The honor has been entirely mine, Your Majesty. Though I should point out that the mission isn't finished. Oh. What remains to be accomplished?" Marcus gestured toward the viewports showing ships from dozens of species approaching Harmony Station, representatives from civilizations throughout the galaxy who had come to study the Human-Sanguine Alliance and explore whether similar cooperation might be possible in their own conflicts. "Everything, Your Majesty. We've proven that peace is possible. Now we get to help others discover how to achieve it." Queen Seraphina smiled with the expression he'd learned to associate with her best ideas. "Captain Steele, I believe our most important work is just beginning." "Our work? Unless you're planning to abandon our partnership now that we've solved the easy problems." Marcus laughed, understanding that Queen Seraphina was right. Helping two species become allies had been simple compared to the challenge of teaching an entire galaxy that cooperation could replace conflict as the foundation of interstellar relations. "Your Majesty," he said with mock formality, "I wouldn't abandon our partnership for anything. After all, someone needs to make sure you don't terrify the diplomats from species that haven't learned to appreciate sanguine charm. And someone needs to make sure you don't volunteer for impossible missions that require standing alone against overwhelming odds. But those are the missions that produce the best results." "Indeed they are, Captain. Indeed they are." As Harmony Station continued its orbit around the binary star system that had become the symbol of successful interspecies cooperation, two former enemies looked toward a future they had helped create. A galaxy where differences would be celebrated rather than feared, where understanding would replace assumption, and where the courage to stand your ground could literally change the universe. The vampire queen had stopped chasing, the human warrior had stopped running, and together they had discovered that the most powerful force in existence wasn't fear or hunger or even survival, it was the simple recognition that enemies could become family when they chose to see possibilities instead of obstacles. Their story would be told for generations as proof that peace was always possible for those brave enough to risk everything for the chance to build something better than what had come before.